Flipping houses, especially the rehab portion, will suck up your bandwidth like a vacuum.
So you need to know how to manage it better.
Most people never figure this one out, and instead of becoming real estate investors that are growing a portfolio that will continue to serve them in monthly passive income, they end up really just buying themselves a job, and an extremely stressful one at that.
Sounds like somebody's got a case of the Mondays.
Unless you wanted to become a contractor. I thought I had it figured out. I would wake up every day, 4 o'clock in the morning. I had a list of all of the contractors and all of the projects that we had going on. I was a one-man band at the time. I was on the GTD train. I remember I had different tags, like one was vampire tag. This is the work that I would do when everybody else was sleeping. I got so serious about my efficiency that I actually hired somebody to follow me around to see if there was any space in my day where I could fit more in. It was certainly working. I was getting a lot done. And then my first daughter was born. And what I realized is, yeah, maybe it was a very efficient use of my time, but my time was running thin. What I actually needed to do was figure out how to be more effective, how to have less input and get more output. Now we're gonna go through the different levels or progressions of being an effective and efficient manager of your real estate organization. But first, I need you to understand this. You don't have to do all 5 steps today. Trust me, if you just take a few of these things and start to implement them right away, which you'll be able to do, you'll already be better than 80 or 90% of managers out there. Our goal is basically threefold. 1, preserve your bandwidth. 2 is mitigate your mistakes. 3, no dropped balls. When I say that, I always have this vision in my head of like a plow going down and just keeping all the things in front of them, making sure that nothing gets off to the sides and gets past them. Or like when you go blow your leaves in your front yard and you're just trying to keep all the leaves in front of you all the time. Or like when everything's going down a conveyor belt, like at some factory, and all the conveyor belts are leading to separate compartments where the things can go into the box and they can be dealt with later in the appropriate way, but nothing gets past it. Kind of like something I've heard before, where you collect it, then you process it, then you organize it, then you plan it, then you do it. Ground zero is disorientation. It's really the lack of a step, but it's where everybody, including myself, started. Everything is new. You don't know what goes where. You're hearing all kinds of information from all kinds of different people about what you need to do, what you don't need to do, and quite frankly, it's overwhelming. If you're lucky, you've picked the right vendors to work with, and you're in a good market, and you've left yourself a little bit of financial contingency so you can weather the storm and stay in the game. And that's the key in this phase, is to stay in the game long enough to be able to see around corners and get to step 2. Or step 1, really, because this was step 0. But you will survive. One thing to note here is it will feel like you're making money because you're playing with such big numbers, but don't get fooled. All right, now on to the real step 1. This is PM planning. I call it PM planning because I had a spreadsheet that was called the PM planning spreadsheet. And this is basically the phase in my life that was the story I told you earlier, when I was really focused on the efficiency and getting as much as I could done personally. This is where you go through every project, every day, with every contractor, every vendor. You make sure that everything's in alignment all the time. You look at all the receipts from the day before to make sure that everything is in alignment with what you would expect to be purchased for that. And if it wasn't, then you would go ask questions. Still not talking about micromanaging here. There's a proper way to go ask a contractor or ask your team why things seem a little bit off. You're likely going to job sites yourself to check these things out to make sure things are in alignment with what you envisioned. Now, it doesn't have to be you that does this. Maybe you have a team member who's doing this for you. But the point is, at this phase, you are looking at every project every day. Now, that's a great start. It truly is. You need to know what's going on. This helps you learn and so on and so forth. But you got to move past this phase if you really want to free up your bandwidth. Now, I call that phase being in the weeds. Now for step 2, moving out of the weeds and into the trees. This is where we started to set weekly expectations. This is where we would go through each project, or only one project, and we would write out every task, every subcontractor, and what we expected them to complete for that week. And then at the end of the week, we would go through and make sure that those things were hit or adjust accordingly. This is really where we began to keep records of what was said and what was actually done. And so we could keep a history on each of the contractors we worked with and the members of our own team, and really ourselves, to make sure that we were performing to the best of our ability. Now in this stage, it doesn't have to be complex at all. I mean, seriously, a pen and paper in a journal, and you can just write out what you think you can get done that week and be reasonable with yourself. You don't need to have stretch goals here. It's about setting reasonable, maybe somewhat optimistic goals, and then managing yourself to hit those goals and anybody on your job site or vendors that you're working with. Set yourself and your team up for wins here. Basically what you're doing with your weekly expectations, you're now setting the foundation for your daily meetings. At this point, your daily meetings aren't reinventing the wheel every day. It's just making sure that you're on track to hit what you set for the week. Step 3, the forest through the trees. This is where you zoom out to break the project up into checkpoints. Now, we call those checkpoints phases, but it's not important for you to call it the same thing that we call it. The important thing is for you to have checkpoints where you can reconcile and recalibrate. So what we do is we break things up into 6 different checkpoints throughout a project. And before that checkpoint starts, we make sure we know what contractors we're going to have, how much we're going to pay them, how much money we need to have for that phase or that checkpoint. We have checklists where we walk through the property and make sure that everything is in order and ready for us to rock before we start working. See, this is where we do our planning. We get a phase or checkpoint ready. This is where we have different stages. We do our planning stage where we go through our checklist, we get our contractors ready, we order all the materials that we know we're going to need for the jobs that are necessary inside of that checkpoint, and then we start the work in progress, the boots on the ground where contractors are actually going in there and working. And then once they're done, we do what we call billing and review. And so that's where we make sure the money was right. We make sure that we hit what we thought we were going to hit financially. And then we have checklists that we use post-phase to make sure that everything was done as we had expected, as we had outlined and agreed upon with different contractors or our own team. That's where we hold accountability before we start our next checkpoint. That's seeing the forest through the trees. Now, finally, we zoom out even more into what I call the aerial view. This is where you're looking at projects as a whole. And when I say project, I don't necessarily just mean the rehab. I mean a project is any work that you need to do to carry out the strategy that you have on a deal that you've bought. On the rehab itself, this means setting up your ledger. These are your books for that project, knowing every dime that is spent on that project, and you break it up in your phases. So now at the end of every phase, you're going to reconcile to make sure that your ledger, your project, your budget is still on track. And if it's not, you're going to figure out a way to make up for lost money. Or you're going to decide that you're going to eat it, and then you need to go get the money for it. This is how you're really looking forward all of the time. But you can't look forward if you haven't made a big picture plan right from the start. So in addition to the ledger, it's also about making smart scopes of work, because with no scope of work, you really have no budget because you don't know what you're going to do. And remember, a smart scope of work is about determining the difference between what is wanted versus what is needed. It's about knowing what the other properties in that neighborhood sell for and what condition they got into to get that price for rent or for sale. You don't go past it because everything past that is diminishing returns. And we're about maximizing profit. This is where you go beyond just pre and post phase checklist. This is where you go to a pre-project checklist, which we call the office block checklist, to make sure things are really set up for your project. And you can find all this stuff on our website. It's all free downloads. And then we have what we call the 81 point checklist, which it's an ever growing checklist. So it's not an 81 point checklist anymore. I think the last time I checked it was like an 88 point checklist. But these are all the things that you're going to look at before you call a project complete, before you decide that it's a livable house. Now, just to be clear, when you finish your 80 whatever point checklist, it is not going to be perfect. If you get an inspection resolution done when you sell the property, they are going to find things. They're hired to find things. If they didn't find anything, they wouldn't have a job. Even when they go into new builds, they find something. And so don't worry about that. In fact, we have a lot of strategies about inspection resolutions. You really don't want to find everything that they're going to find because they'll find other things. And so it's okay if things come up. That's all I'm saying for now. We can talk about that another day. And then when you go to put a tenant in there, I promise you, when somebody's actually living in the house, they're going to find things that you could have never found otherwise. Now we're going to zoom out even further. This is your organizational outlook. This is Google Earth. Here you're going to focus on the things in your real estate organization that really matter. This is where you're going to focus on building better scopes of work, building the skills to know how to build better scopes of work. This is where you're going to work on leveling up your vendors. You're always going to be focusing on the depth chart of vendors, mainly wholesalers and contractors that you work with, always trying to find better ones and more of them. See, growing these guys is directly correlated with the growth of your organization. And you're going to focus on your skills as a project manager, which is basically what we talked about here today. And finally, you're going to focus on what is arguably the most important of all, and that's finding better deals. Deals are what drive your business. And it just turns out that these four things actually make up what's called our all-weather approach, which we've made a whole video about. So why don't you check it out?